got it. We'll make sure that I'm not sharing the screen and my notes with you because you don't need those, just me. All right, so thank you everybody who is joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. So we're just gonna get it kicked off. Good evening and welcome to the lived experience of COVID-19 in Canada, a lecture exploring the 2021 Margaret Angus Research Fellowship project and the impact of the current global pandemic. I'm just gonna get my face out of my way here. There we go. Thank you, Kevin, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining me on your Thursday night. I hope everybody is cozy on their couch and enjoying an after dinner treat. We're going to start the evening, as Kevin mentioned, with a lecture lasting about an hour, followed with questions and a conversation. So to begin, I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to me, just so you know what's going on. So my name is Savannah Sewell, and I'm an emerging museum professional. I graduated from the Master of Museum Studies program at the University of Toronto in the spring of 2020. My previous alma mater, McMaster University, from which I hold an honors Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology. And during my short career, I've had the opportunity to explore physical archaeology, theoretical and applied anthropology, and a variety of museum positions. My archaeological experience was what led me to my love and my passion for culture and the human experience. And during my undergraduate degree, I was fortunate enough to receive an experiential education grant, which I applied to a bioarchaeological field school course in at the Black Friary site in Trim, Ireland. Upon my return, I also participated as a student in a field school opportunity at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Hamilton in partnership with Six Nations, and as a teaching assistant at the Henry House excavation at the Museum of Oshawa site with Trent University. During my graduate degree, I completed many projects with local museums, including visitor studies research with the Royal Ontario Museum, experience development and design with the Ontario Science Centre, and a marketing and communications internship with the Aga Khan Museum, supporting their public programming. To complete my master's degree, my exhibition thesis project was to research, design, and implement a traveling exhibition for the Canadian Language Museum on the subject of sign language in Canada. Myself, along with 3 other phenomenal students, delivered the exhibit, The Sign Languages of Canada, which is available online on their website if you're interested. During these degrees, I worked within the healthcare system, first in Oshawa and then in Toronto. I worked as a dietary aide, completing the circle of care and delivering patient nutrition. As such, I developed an interest in healthcare and in the field of medical anthropology. As the pandemic developed, I held various diverse jobs. First, I continued as a dietary aide at Lakeridge Health Oshawa. Then into the fall of 2020, I began to work as a general contractor, installing plexiglass partitions into the court system of Ontario all the way to Windsor. And then after that, in the winter of 2021, I held a position at the Sperling Vaccination Clinic with the Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre in Barrie. This information is important to frame the next hour or so of the lecture and to ensure that each of you understands how this project came to be and the general lens and interest of this specific global crisis from my side. Please be advised, this project is not a medical journal nor a medical record, and I lack a very important piece of paper to be able to publish something like that. So that's not, I don't hold a medical degree, I'm an anthropologist. All right, so moving on. Just a little bit of an agenda. We'll start with the original inspiration for the project and what the process was to begin this journey, next to the methods. And then we'll spend some time exploring the project research content, the manuscript discussions, and the pandemic events and protocols that galvanize the requirement for work like this in the museum field. As the collection was a large portion of the process for the building of the COVID-19 project at the Museum of Healthcare, we will explore the artifacts and narratives donated to the museum by our wonderful community. And lastly, we'll discuss potential future application of the work, both in the Museum of Healthcare and the field of museums as a whole. Please hold all questions to the end and feel free to reach out after the presentation if you'd like to discuss any content further. I'll get to a little bit more detail in a second, but as we go through, I'm going to tell you what each of the images are, and just starting with this one, I'll give a little bit more detail in a second. So this particular image is captioned, hand sanitization is a key part of protecting ourselves and our patients. I'd like to begin this presentation with a land acknowledgement. This project was completed at the Museum of Healthcare in Kingston, Ontario, and I've borrowed a version of the land acknowledgement from Queen's University for the occasion. I'm also presenting from Oshawa, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional territory and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. While I work on these lands, I would like to acknowledge the signatory communities of Williams treaties, as well as the Mississauga Nation and other members of the broader Indigenous community, as many of the narratives and collection items represented tonight were experiences across Turtle Island. So let us acknowledge that the Museum of Healthcare at Kingston is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. We are grateful to be able to live, learn, research, and play on these lands. To acknowledge this traditional territory is to recognize its longer history, one predating the establishment of the earliest European colonies and colonial bodies, such as the institutions of academia and museums. It is also to acknowledge this territory's significance for the Indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live upon it, and whose practices and spiritualities are tied to the land and continue to develop in relationship to the territory and its other inhabitants today. This particular image is Dr. Rogers, an emergency physician, observed his critical ill patient in the CT scanner, the results of which were key in the saving of his life. Alrighty. So these beautiful images, I would like to acknowledge Dr. Heather Patterson, whose images these are. She's been an absolute pleasure to work with, and we're going to see her work throughout this lecture as well as throughout the manuscript. Dr. Patterson's work came to us through Claire, one of the staff members at Museum of Healthcare, who sent me an email saying, wow, aren't these beautiful? How amazing would it be to involve these in the project and to involve Dr. Patterson? And one quick email and a phone call, and she was in. You've been so incredibly passionate and enthusiastic, and I appreciate it to the ends of the earth for these beautiful, beautiful photos. So this collection of images was captured by Dr. Heather Patterson. Dr. Patterson is an emergency physician and a photographer based in Calgary, Alberta, who was granted unrestricted access by the Provincial Health Authority to photograph on the front lines of COVID-19 pandemic. She says that as an emergency physician during the pandemic, she experienced a range of emotions, beginning with uncertainty, apprehension, and grief for the loss of how they provided care in the past. There was, however, a shift in her perspective as she witnessed the resilience, teamwork, and compassion of those working in the hospitals. Thank you again, Dr. Patterson. We really appreciate it. And one more big thank you. I would like to personally thank each individual who contributed to this project. It has been almost impossible to ensure that each of you have your name up there. I went through every email I could find and make sure I got everybody. We've been so fortunate and just so lucky to have so many people involved. So thank you so much. If your particular story or artifact is not in this presentation or the posts that have already happened, I promise it's in the manuscript, and it is absolutely a cherished portion of this project at the museum. I'm also personally grateful to my supervisor, Dr. Ian Gemmell, Ian M. Fraser, and Janine M. Schweitzer, the Museum of Healthcare staff, my family and friends who are currently hopefully watching this lecture. I'm so incredibly grateful to you all to have this opportunity. Thank you. This particular image is captioned "Donning and doffing PPE with each patient encounter is part of the regular routine for Dr. Nickel, an emergency physician." Whoop. Sorry, having a little bit of technical difficulties as there we go. Sorry about that, guys. All righty. And right on to the presentation, the proposal. So starting right at the proposal, as any project, it started with a proposal and application to the position for the 2021 MARF. The inspiration for the project came from my daily interactions with clients at the Sperling Vaccination Clinic in Barrie. As I was processing and working with each client during the vaccination process, each would chat with me. If you haven't noticed yet, I tend to be quite naturally chatty. Most of the clients would tell me about their experiences that they'd gone through the pandemic, whether it was not seeing their families or even the difficulty accessing certain medications. Now, because of my anthropological mind, I started trying to categorize and remember these situations and these stories, wondering if some sort of collection could be made in order to safeguard the everyday details of experiencing the pandemic in Canada. I was aware of several museums who had teams working on COVID-19 projects and collections, but I wasn't sure to which degree they were focusing on the small everyday experiences. So when a past supervisor of mine sent the posting, it seemed like the perfect role and space for me to complete the project. However, for those who have been involved in the MARF projects for a number of years, this process was quite different. Due to the pandemic being current and ongoing, I could not do what others had done in the past and use the museum's collections and resources to create a research document. So instead, I proposed my own. The proposal had three main sections: the thesis or research questions, the programming, and the collection. Now, as some of you may already know, and I'm sure you've experienced, proposals and projects tend to evolve. Though the original research goals and questions remain the same, timelines, current COVID protocols, and other obstacles did limit the ability to complete or permit some of the deliverables. For example, it was the hope to run a social media campaign similar to Humans of New York in order to highlight the donated narratives. However, because of the time constraints and limitations before participants to sign waivers, it was not possible. So the research questions were quite simple. How have Canadians and Canadian residents experienced the COVID-19 pandemic? What has changed? How did it change? How might these changes continue into the future? And how can we curate a useful base of collection of artifacts and narratives to benefit the future of COVID-19 research and education at the museum? I knew that a summer wasn't going to be enough time to curate, research, and build an exhibit, but what could be done to set it up for this sort of accessibility for the future is what I wanted to do. So there were certain stages to the project. There were several stages over the past several months, beginning with the application and ending with this lecture. In order to represent the experience of Canadians and Canadian residents in the most authentic and holistic way, a crowdsourcing technique was used in order to curate the collection. After some housekeeping items, a media release was sent out to the public and the museum's community asking for participation in the project. The media release asked for stories, artifacts, and anything that anyone would want to share in order to safeguard the lived experience for future research. From there, we began receiving documents, stories, artifacts, social media messages, drop-offs, and mail. That was the first time I got so much mail, and actual physical mail. Very exciting moment. I chose not to edit these donations in any way. If someone was donating a story or artifact to our collection, it was most likely in a very meaningful way already, and I wanted to make sure that it represented that story as well as it could and as authentically as it could. We received almost all of the artifacts that we'd originally added to the list, with the exception of a ventilator and a vial of the AstraZeneca vaccine. I started the next stage of the project, research, letting these artifacts and stories inform my writing and to direct the content within the research manuscript in order to present an accurate depiction of the time. It was my hope that someday these narratives and artifacts will be able to effectively communicate the nuances of the Canadian experience during the COVID-19 pandemic to a variety of audiences in a very dynamic and fun way. It should be mentioned that this project is currently being used in an experiential and classroom learning for an elementary school in Kingston. And it's going to be kind of a process of field trip as well as virtual field trip to teach some museological practices such as collection building as well as COVID-19 content. Media, we were incredibly fortunate in a wonderful turn of events. The media release asking for COVID-19 stories got the interest of a few media outlets in Ontario. You'll see a couple examples there up on the screen. I had the opportunity to participate in a podcast conversation with the Queen's University Podcast Campus Beat and their affiliate radio station CFRC. I spoke on the radio with CBC's Fresh Morning Air for Toronto and even did an interview along with Kevin for Global News. The story was also featured in the WIG Standard and amongst other print and virtual news media. I believe that the media breakthrough is what really brought this project so success with our crowdsourcing collection. However, with some success comes some challenges. Because of all the media coverage was being provincial and specific to the GTA and Kingston area, the vast number of donations and narratives are from the GTA and Kingston area. So please keep that in mind. The COVID-19 project and collection will continue to grow with the museum, and I hope they will represent a more national Canada on a larger scale in the future. Deliverables. The deliverables of our project accumulate to 5 blog posts, a physical artifact collection, a digital collection, an archive of personal narratives, the research manuscript, and the public lecture. All of this is available and will be in the links on the website. The collection and project, like all permanent museum collections, will continue to grow, like I just said, in the future. And if any participation is of interest to anybody on this call or anybody else they know, it will be through the museum. All right, into our content. So to begin the content section for this presentation, I thought we'd set a base for the vernacular of this particular project. Now, as juvenile as it might seem, defining everyday terms in a document such as this one, I thought it was important to give a sort of cheat sheet for our predecessors. While studying or working in museums, it is customary to design and curate collections in a way that will safeguard and make them accessible in 100 years. So not the next generation, not the generation after that, but 1 or 2 after that. Once we're gone, it's really tough to communicate. So what I did as a favor to our future readers is a glossary at the beginning of the manuscript and project to explain how terms changed or were used during the pandemic. So I'm just going to go through kind of a couple here. Community spread, the definition being an increase in cases with one geographical area where the infected vector is direct and in-person contact. The COVID cause, the fight against COVID-19 as a community with the aims and objectives being everyone participating in public health and safety guidelines for the betterment of the community and the eradication of COVID-19. Essential, pertaining most often to appointments or workers, any behavior or activity necessary for survival, as well as the continued function of necessary societal services and goods. A complicated one, but it has changed so much, and I thought that was really critical for people to understand why we use the term essential so much. Flattening the curve, used as a slogan to communicate early communal efforts to mitigate the effects and widespread transmission of the virus, intrinsically linked to the wave model of infectious disease, the proverbial curve being the exponential representation of the infection rate. Lockdown, the term used most frequently for the limitations on activities, travel, curfew, buying power, and services and social gatherings during peaks in the pandemic. Isolation, the segregation of an infected individual away from others that could be susceptible to the virus. Very different from quarantine, the segregation of an individual who has been in close contact with an infected person or exposed to potential source of COVID-19 transmission. Physical or social distancing, social precautions enforced on all levels of authority, from shop owners to federal government, mainly implementing the 2 meter between individuals to avoid the potential for droplet transmission. And state of emergency, a governmental decision to assume authority over decision-making and processes that they do not regularly possess. It's not to say that these glossary terms wouldn't be helpful in the reading and understanding of this project today, because I think a lot of our definitions have changed and evolved, but they will definitely be very useful in the future. Other terms that we could include are things like cohort or cohorting, to explain how certain COVID protocols have been used in schools. This image is STARS Air Ambulance developed protocol and procedure to safely transport critically unwell COVID patients from rural areas to the ICU. Pictured on the roof of the Foothills Medical Center, the pilots and aeromedical crew returned to the helicopter after transporting a patient to the ICU. We're just going to do a little bit of a timeline, not that you all didn't live it, but let's, do a little bit of a overview just to understand and get our minds wrapped around the project. November 2020, cases of what was labeled pneumonia without a known source spread through the community of Hubei, the community of Wuhan in Hubei province of China. In December 2020, the infection rate rose and was reported to the WHO by New Year's Day. On January 7th of 2020, the genetic code of COVID-19 was mapped and identified as a new strain of coronavirus. As well in January, Canadians experienced whispers and small-scale media coverage about COVID-19 during their winter holidays. The coverage was similar to that of Ebola or swine flu, though a series of medical crises, it was congruent to past events, and most Canadians did not raise concerns surrounding COVID-19 on a social level. February 2020, Italy was one of the first countries to be hit with a devastating rate of infection after China. And these were possibly some of the first images of the effects of COVID-19 that were streamed readily in Canada. Most Canadians also felt a much deeper connection to the Italian outbreaks because of our internalized perception of otherness. So remember that within Western culture and Canadian culture, Italy tends to be a normalized place of vacation and a much more accessible culture when it comes to entertainment and cuisine than China does. So, however, it was this accessibility and recognition, as well as the now impending global spread, that had Canadians taking a second take. In March of 2020, the first case landed in Canada. The first community transmitted case took place in Vancouver, quickly followed by hundreds of outbreaks nationally. So when we remember back to our March 2020 and the second week of March there, what did you notice? What was it? The March or spring break extension? Was it your boss telling you to take your laptop home? Was it the NBA shutting down and players not coming on the floor? That was what did it for me. Was it school not returning? Things like that. What went through your mind? What did you experience and notice as being the big unprecedented moment? So schools did not return until the following year, with some provinces and territories not returning to in-class instruction until 2021 school year. Virtual work and learning was the norm. Travel restrictions came into place. Both local and international travel were advised against, with airline, train, and public transportation shutdowns and the American border closed. Reflecting on our first experiences with the daily impacts of COVID-19 can say a lot about how things have pivoted and how information is disseminated throughout a community. In spring 2020, most of it was spent with a series of lockdowns and stay-at-home orders. The population was at the height of COVID-19 safety, while professional research was highlighted and published daily in order to keep individuals informed. Physical assistance or financial assistance programs like CERB were introduced at the federal level for both individuals and businesses that were struggling with the shutdowns. In summer of 2020, mask mandates were introduced nationally. Social and physical distancing were public norms, with essential business conforming to the local guidelines. Remember that mask mandates were not introduced at the same time nationally, but rather provincially, one by one, starting in early summer and then going all the way until November. Things like store limits, tape or signs to where to stand, and arrows for aisles were introduced in almost every space. The summer also brought the COVID-19 numbers down, which allowed for some social spaces to be opened back up and to be enjoyable in very small capacities. For example, patios at restaurants. In the fall of 2020 and the flu season saw an increase in cases and a surge in development and planning for vaccines. In December of 2021, Ontario and some other communities in Canada saw another lockdown, beginning just before Christmas Day and running through January. December also saw the first vaccinations in Canada, administered in Ontario and Quebec and given to healthcare professionals. As January rolled around, January through the July was our vaccine rollout. From the start of January, Canadian vaccine rollout took place. The first vaccine doses were set aside for healthcare and first responder staff, then immunocompromised individuals, and by age. Now in the fall, as we experience the fall of 2021, travel restrictions and public spaces are lessening with the high vaccination, restrictions on public spaces are lessening with high vaccination rates. Just last night, Scotiabank Arena had its very first audience for the Raptors in more than 600 days with a full audience. Vaccination mandates are ensuring safe spaces for anyone using public transportation services or healthcare services or public services or healthcare services. Vaccinations are in the process of being approved for children aged 5 to 12. School is back and in person. But in some areas of Canada, they continue to experience high rates of infection and high rates of hospitalization and severe COVID due to earlier lenience on vaccination and public health and safety protocol. This image is vaccination offered protection and hope that the pandemic would soon be under control. So as we move forward, let's keep in mind some of the landmark decisions that influence our day-to-day activities and the decisions that we make surrounding COVID-19 in our everyday lives. Lockdown, school and work closures, financial assistance programs, travel restrictions, mask mandates, public health guidelines, and vaccination mandates. These could have influences on things like childcare, your ability or lack thereof to provide the necessities of life or care for certain people in your household, mental health, rates of domestic violence and dependency issues, access to necessary treatment or programming, food insecurities, socialization, normalization, your ability to perform in your space of education or employment, as well as with travel restrictions, there being pros and cons for things like the Atlantic bubble, which allowed for trade and travel within a certain area, but did eventually fail. And cons with travel being, relationships between families or trade and transportation issues with necessities or necessary equipment and products. Oh, I forgot to introduce my picture, which is one of my favorites. So this image was on the COVID ward. A moment of celebration was captured when this woman received news that she was discharged from the COVID ward. As we've all experienced the pandemic over the last 19 to 20 months and have navigated the complex policy and legislation changes associated with the COVID cause. As a quick review, this includes things like social and physical distancing, mask mandates, school closures, and transition to virtual work and learning, stay-at-home orders, vaccination mandates, and all of these procedural changes were made and implicated in order to attempt to benefit the fight against COVID-19 and to mitigate loss of human life. Some of these changes, such as CERB, were created in order to benefit the economic wellness of the individual residents and businesses so they would be able to survive the pandemic. However, not all were equally successful. Out of all of these policy and legislation changes, the biggest challenge during COVID-19 pandemic has been communication. The vectors of communication are scattered and variable, and the ability to communicate clearly and effectively has been challenging for a number of reasons. Firstly, information can only be communicated if it is known. This was a particular challenge at the beginning of the pandemic as leadership was operating with a very limited understanding of the virus and what should be done to protect their populations. For example, Dr. Tam communicated in the spring of 2020 that masks were not required or as useful as some other techniques. Rather humorously, she also suggested that the individuals should be wearing masks when engaging in physical intimacy with strangers. Why you were engaging in physical intimacy with strangers during a global pandemic, I'm not sure. Since that time, mask mandates and the critical importance of mask wearing has been proven and has become part of our daily lives. Secondly, there have been levels of miscommunication due to unclear and unfamiliar language, differing opinions, or even the variety of geographical area. Thirdly, unreliable or inaccurate sources of health and pandemic information have run rampant over the last 20 months. With a large portion of Canada receiving their news from social media platforms, there's been a great opportunity for the spread of inaccurate claims. For people narrating a rhetoric of racially fueled inaccuracies to the claim of difference of opinion towards the topic of bodily autonomy versus necessity of vaccination in the face of immunocompromised patients. It's important to recognize one's own experience when it comes to communication and how it influenced each of our daily lives during the pandemic. Did you refrain from an activity because it was meant to be unsafe or not suggested, only to see a neighbor or friend participating? Maybe like travel? How about when navigating a social situation? Were you perhaps unclear about the social or physical distancing and what was meant to happen and what they were comfortable with? When we're influenced by pandemic protocol like this, it is a great example of the dynamic cultural upheaval that a global crisis can have on the everyday life. This image is the Zone Emergency Operations Committee group meet daily on the onset of the pandemic. Responsible for coordinating the pandemic response in southern Alberta, this powerhouse group managed areas including carrying out government directives, managing issues related to vulnerable population groups, assisting in coordination of PPE, overseeing assessment and communication centers, as well as coordinating all acute care workforce issues, operative processes, and pandemic response units. One of the most important questions that I've had to ask during this project has been, what have the impacts been from all of these changes to Canadian daily life? How have school closures affected students and their family life? How have public health protocols affected celebrations, cultural traditions, and interpersonal dynamics? Rather introspectively, we can begin with the changes in our daily lives. One of the largest impacts to each of our daily lives is playing out before us right now, technology. Now, chatty or not, this lecture is required of the fellowship so that the fellow can share their project and research with the community. However, this year, it was a very easy transition to a virtual lecture for a few reasons. One, Jessica, the 2020 MARF, also gave a virtual lecture because of the impact of the pandemic. And two, each of us is so used to the reality of virtual work, socialization, and everyday life that the video and audio capabilities to communicate are a normal practice. At the beginning of the pandemic, there were difficulties maneuvering into a more virtual focused life. People struggled to access certain technologies. Some businesses even fumbled on how they would provide the opportunity to work from home. However, it quickly became the norm and even adapted. A similar situation happened with education. But we cannot oversimplify the COVID-19 impact when it comes to working and learning conditions. Functioning from home for these tasks comes with its own complications. Working and learning in one's homes also means that families were home together. Navigating a new normal with increased face-to-face time and sharing spaces that they otherwise would not. Parents became teachers and children became coworkers. Though there's much more research to be done, some preliminary work indicates that the biggest negative change was to our mental health. Even with reminders, mindful practices, and those dreaded daily walks, the mental health of Canadians was quickly deteriorating. And not just adults, children's mental health was suffering too from the lack of physical activity, another COVID casualty, lack of socialization, and the monotony of lockdowns. Some of the tangible components of these studies included the amount of alcohol consumption in parents with children under the age of 18. So if work and education pivoted to be virtual, bringing with it some benefits, but mostly challenges to Canadian daily lives, what happened to the social lives of Canadians? Some of them became virtual as well. Games nights, celebrations such as graduations and birthday parties, and holidays were even done virtually. But as the pandemic progressed and public health measures allowed in-person visiting, social situations turned again. This time it was about who you were going to choose to spend your time with. For example, before the vaccination rollout, each household bubble could only be so big. So who are you going to see? Would you visit outside on someone's lawn or porch, or try to find a public space to share? After vaccinations, socialization also became trickier. As we were experiencing Thanksgiving weekend, did you ask your family members if they were vaccinated before a dinner? That was the recommendation of public health, but it's a difficult question and one that begs for more social interaction, stuff that we're not used to. The impact has been greatest on the youngest Canadians. For those pandemic babies that have never been socialized in the way others have been before, it is anticipated that young children will be between 1 to 3 years behind in education and social skills. Now, the babies waving at the grocery store would beg to differ. They are very friendly, but you never know. We'll see how things work out in the future. This particular image is Dr. Coder cared for this patient and his brother while admitted to the COVID ward. After finishing his clinical duties for the day, he would check on the condition of his patients in the ICU who were previously under his care. So what will life look like afterwards? What happens now? Encouragingly, the numbers in September and October of 2021 have been much lower in large portions of Canada than anticipated for the fourth wave for most of the country. Unfortunately, Alberta is experiencing numbers far higher than they could have prepared for, and the results are overburdening hospitals, mortality, and fear across the province of the future of the hospitalizations. There are many contributing factors to Alberta's current outbreak, and particularly the government's policies that have allowed for outbreaks to occur. It is important to remember that the impact to Canadian lives comes at a variety of levels. Though from loss of life to economic to social, and each individual will be struggling with particular after effects and realities. As we move forward, we must remain cautious and vigilant as we enter the flu season and it approaches. Those who are immunocompromised or in high contact situations can now receive their third dose of COVID-19 vaccine. Schools are returning and have returned and running a series of cohort, virtual hybrid, and COVID protocol-laden situations. As Canadian residents experience the pandemic, let's remember that we are all continuing to navigate our new protocol in familiar spaces. There will be much more to unpack from our metaphorical backpacks as the COVID-19 virus evolves. Some individuals have experienced great personal loss that will take years to mourn or recover, depending on the situation. Some will be dealing with the side effects of the shutdown, such as lack of socialization or loss of in-person education, while some will be battling mental illness or addiction issues that have been spawned because of the social and psychological stressors of the pandemic. It is foreseeable to predict that masks, sanitization, and COVID-19 public health measures will continue to be a part of our reality moving forward in Canada. Currently, a vaccination confirmation is required to participate in dining and social spaces. Certain provinces have begun using a QR code, while others are functioning with digital or physical receipts. An international document will most likely be introduced in order to ensure vaccination status for travel in the future. The vaccination mandates that are currently impacting essential services will continue to have an influence on employment rates in the field of healthcare and social services. Just like any other global crisis or cultural phenomenon, this pandemic will not simply end. As a reminder from your first year introduction to anthropology course, culture is dynamic. Canadian culture and daily practices are impacted by a variety of influences constantly. And similarly to how social protocol following world wars changed, it will now as well. We will see the pandemic continue to impact our everyday use of language, the patterns of consumerism, the success or failure of media and media content, the use of technology, and decision-making processes surrounding social events and celebrations, but most prominently in our everyday decisions surrounding the safety of ourselves and our loved ones. This image, Phil, a man in his early 40s, was intubated with worsening COVID pneumonia. A moment of air or quiet after being turned from the prone position. His nurse had just washed his face, applied lip balm, and dimmed the lights. So this portion, we're going to move on from content and we're going to talk a little bit about the collection. So as mentioned before, the collection was crowdsourced from the museum and national community. Individuals and institutions alike were asked to donate items from the collection to physically represent the pandemic in Canada. The collection was delivered in a variety of ways, and all items were accessioned in order to complete a foundational collection for the Museum of Healthcare. These items will hopefully be used in the future research, exhibiting, and education on the topic of COVID-19 pandemic and the Canadian experience. With all collections, there are challenges. Some of the items we wish to collect are still in use, and therefore we cannot justify keeping those in the collection while the pandemic is ongoing. There were also particular challenges with permissions gained to collect certain items, or for certain people to donate those items. Some were concerned in the policies of their employers to be donating potentially confidential information or pertaining medical supplies. So speed bumps in the road with every project, but those are some of the ones that we experienced for this particular. Just a little bit of an overview for some of these artifacts. Some of them are fairly common, you know what they are, such as the vaccine. Our rapid test devices, we were lucky enough to receive an entire box of those from the Brockville Chamber of Commerce that were running a program for their businesses, their local businesses. We have two hand sanitizers, one that was produced by a brewery in Oshawa, All or Nothing, as well as some news reports of the Gananoque Reporter above. So I'm going to highlight a few of the contributors to the collection, mostly because their contributions were large, and we would like to kind of highlight a few of their artifacts. The Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre has provided artifacts from several of their sites to the collection. This item includes vaccination, staff clothing, signage, vials, transportation tools, PPE, and documentation. So on the screen, you'll see a styrofoam biological transport box for the COVID-19 test with a removable lid. You'll see under an empty vial of Pfizer BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine. A signage for the testing center. Actually, I believe that one is my t-shirt from the vaccination team, and as well as our other testing and equipment underneath it. KFL&A was also provided a variety of items to the collection from their public health units and vaccination sites. Several of their leadership and staff also donated valuable contact tracing information, images, documentation, and personal narratives of their experiences during the pandemic. Here we see some more vaccination staff t-shirts there, a copy of Ministry of Health Ontario report of adverse events following immunization, the kind of information and documentation that will be very informational and important to future research, a handmade thank you card for Dr. Moore, as well as a color copy of sign, keep 2 meters away from others. Felicity Pope, also a member of the Museum of Healthcare's VOD, started collecting COVID-19 items early in the pandemic. No doubt old habits die hard, as she's been a prominent member of the medical museum world in Ontario over her career. So the items here, we have 2 handmade 3-layer fabric masks made in 2021. Both masks were worn. Blue mask was an early style made in April 2020 by Patty Lay, a registered nurse and neighbor. And she gave the masks, or this is Felicity saying, she gave masks to me and my husband early in the pandemic. This model was awkward to tie on, and I soon abandoned it for her later model. We also see Moderna and Pfizer models, vials, as well as her lawn sign, which she so wonderfully gave to us from the Rotary, saying, "I got the shot," and thanking volunteers for their vaccination. In the collection, we also have a series of books. The books were donated by the participation of the 19 Tales authors, as well as Dr. Graham Elder. So to illustrate the more creative items in our collection, 3 books were donated, you can see above, as well as Dr. Elder. Dr. Elder's donated his series of COVID-19 novels. The 2 books explore a fictional struggle of characters navigating the COVID-19 pandemic while trying to find a cure. And 19 Tales is a collaboration of Durham region authors that all provided short stories, some lending analogies of consumerism and human nature during global crisis, and others recollections of the COVID-19 experience, and both are available publicly. We also got collection items that were personal, such as Allison's wedding handkerchief and monogrammed masks. So I'll read you her narrative here. I am a very organized person. So when I got engaged in September 2019, I got to work organizing our wedding and getting everything booked. We had all our vendors booked by January 2020, and I was feeling good about things. I felt like I was prepared for anything, but that could possibly go wrong, but I was not prepared for a global pandemic. Her story is also posted on the blog, as well as will be in the collection. So we were very lucky to get her personal items from her wedding. Thank you so much, Allison. The narratives were also a very big portion of the content of this project, and I wanted to ensure that any future research would have voices of Canadians in a variety of situations in order to not cast a shadow on or any opinions on those particular situations. So as I navigated the narrative donations, I was faced with a cluster of emotions. Some of the narratives are simple, cute, and funny accounts of the COVID-19 lockdowns and the quirky tricks of being with the same people all day. Some were beautifully crafted art or poetry representing someone's experience, but some were sad. They spoke of loss, of emotional and mental turmoil, or even of never-ending challenges that they faced each day. People like Dr. Neil Hobbs connected his community with a newsletter, ensuring that his neighbors and friends stayed connected so their small parish in Sydenham would survive the pandemic. Miranda suffered a horrific accident while exercising, doing one of her favorite activities. Her story details the challenges of being an inpatient in a hospital during a pandemic, the limit on family and friend visits, the rules surrounding outside time, and even the struggles to access rehabilitation and therapy services. Unfortunately, due to the outpouring of support and donation of these stories, I won't be able to share them all with you tonight. However, they will be available at the museum and in the written manuscript, and if anybody would like any other conversation, please reach out. I'm going to read you the narratives themselves and not give too much dialogue surrounding. I want you to hear the narratives themselves without myself. My purpose today is to share with you my thoughts and feelings when one loses a loved one during COVID-19. It is a totally different experience than we are comfortable with, at least for me. First off, just having someone sick in the hospital is not the same. Only one person can visit and has to be the same person each day. Makes the patient lonelier and feeling forgotten and the caregiver stressed. When your loved one passes on and you begin the funeral arrangements, the visitation is limited to a certain number and you must make an appointment, wear masks, and social distance. The receiving line is awkward and impersonal. Each person, you might not recognize them under their masks, passes through 6 feet from you, not hugging, handshaking, etc. A few words of condolence as they move on, however cold and indifferent it seemed. People dropping by with condolences and food are missed. That in-person contact, so much better than phone calls. But under the circumstances, we have no choice. Opening the doors to that friendly and caring person is a great loss to the grieving process. Because of COVID-19, your immediate family cannot come and you are alone to go through this planning. Now, I'm not saying I didn't have someone close to me for support, but not having your sons or daughters there sure makes it harder. The day of the cemetery service, again, the number is limited. Masks are on and distance maintained, no sense of closeness or support as you stand with perhaps one or two other persons. For me, I drove to the church by myself, and following the service, I drove home. A half dozen close relatives joined me for lunch. Normally, family and friends would gather to celebrate the deceased life with stories and memories of the time spent with him or her. What a loss for those grieving. I think for a lot of people, I know for me, a lot of grieving was done during his sickness. Every day I prayed to God that suffering would end, even knowing that there was only way it would end. Then, of course, you feel some guilt that perhaps you should not have asked for this release from pain for him. In the days and weeks that follow, you get phone calls, no visits, of course, and so you spend a lot of your time alone in contemplating this new life and where you go from here. I must say that the funeral personnel are exceptional and do their best to ease your pain for you and your family. Putting the service online for those unable to be present is very helpful. Death in COVID is nothing like what we've known from the past. I pray every day that those who have lost loved ones to COVID and other diseases, I know that their journey through the funeral and grieving process will be so different, and I can only imagine that God will be with them to ease the way. In early March 2020, we set out on a two-day cruise of South America. We felt quite safe as the COVID-19 virus was non-existent there. Halfway through the cruise, I became ill with what was diagnosed as acute bronchitis. When I went to the onboard medical center, I was given 45-minute oxygen treatment and prescribed presidone, the doctors are going to catch me for that one, antibiotics, cough syrup, and a new type of puffer. I remained unwell for the remainder of the cruise, as well as we entered the terminal, medical staff were there to take our temperatures. I had a fever and was told to monitor it and call my family doctor. We arrived home April 7th, 3 a.m. We called our family doctor upon waking up that morning, and I was advised to go to the COVID testing center. April 9th, I was told I had the virus and to go to emergency at our local hospital. Upon arriving there, my husband was not allowed to enter the facility. Little did we know that we would not see each other for the next 7 weeks. I remember being in an isolation room in an emergency and then being admitted to another room. I do not recall being in this room, nor how long I was there before I was taken to the ICU, where I was intubated and put on a ventilator. I was in ICU for several weeks. I was told that my husband, who was recovering at home from a different case of COVID, was called and asked to prepare the family that I had taken a bad turn and might not pull through. There were concerns that I might not leave the hospital as I required such high level of oxygen. My kidneys had failed and there were some heart issues as well as other concerns. To everyone's amazement, I did recover and after 7 weeks returned home on oxygen. I no longer needed the oxygen by the end of January 2021. Since having COVID, I still break out every few weeks with shingles rash, which is very sore and very uncomfortable. My right hand developed a very strong tremor after COVID. I have to be careful carrying things. It is in my right hand. My kidney function is very low and I'm required further testing. Also, I have a severe vertigo when I lie down. I eat every night when rolling over wakes me up in the most unpleasant feeling. I continue to have a lot of mucus and cough during the night. The nerves in my chest are sensitive and have a burning sensation. All of this is tolerable and I am just so thankful to still be here. I've had 2 Pfizer vaccinations and do all I can to avoid the current Delta virus. Elder care in Ontario was already struggling before COVID-19 emerged and shut down most of society in the early spring of 2020. Many of our elderly population were being warehoused in large privately owned institutions settings. A small number that were able to were aging at a home with the help of their PSWs employed by private companies. To keep profits high and make money for their investors, most companies paid their personal service workers as little as possible, with many making barely above the legislated minimum wage. It was often precarious work, and the more often than not employed mostly women and people of color. To keep a large clientele, mostly private, for profit companies only allowed a minimal amount of time to be spent with each client, as PSWs performing the most necessary tasks as quickly as possible. Once COVID became a crisis, even higher demands were placed upon the entire healthcare community. And with elder care and the personal support workers that cared for them, we had more responsibility, more to accomplish on each shift, less access to personal protective equipment, and more difficult shifts to work. We also were the lowest paid and most high and least represented sector in healthcare. Many completely lacked proper union representation, and complaints went unheeded. PSWs had people's lives in their hands in an unsafe working environment while not getting fair wages and having voices heard. PSWs were getting sick and becoming unable to work, which made the already existing staffing crisis worse. Sometimes LTC homes had nobody show up for shift and left dozens of elderly people without proper care. Many PSWs sadly died because of COVID-19 and because of their lack of resources from the employers and government. It got so bad that CAF had to come in and take over many LTC homes in Ontario and Quebec. It became obvious to us that we must change not only our current model for elder care, but we also changed our thinking about how elder care works. This is where the initial impetus for the Home Care Workers Cooperative developed. Personal support worker Danielle Turpin initially began meeting with Russ Christensen of Canadian Workers Co-op Federation to discuss how we create a home care company based on cooperative model. Denise Armstrong and Amy Furlow, PSWs with decades of combined experience in home care and long-term care environments, both seeing the problems themselves, quickly joined into the endeavor. Danielle, Denise, and Amy became the official founders of the Home Care Workers Cooperative in the summer of 2021. My name is Fraser Hardman, and I live in Prince Edward County, Ontario. In spring 2020, during the earlier days of the pandemic, my wife Robin and I wrote a song, Crazy COVID World, in which we tried to encapsulate the various emotions that we were all feeling at the same time. Having completed the song, I shared it with Seventh Town, a Celtic folk band that I perform with, Martin Smith, Trisha Elliott, Megan Blow, and myself. At the time, it was not permitted for us to physically get together, but we each recorded our own individual parts at home, shared the files with one another electronically, and finally, Martin brought the overall recording together. This was quite a learning curve for some of us, but we are fortunate that we are now have the technology to enable this. And this focus for some creative musical activity was very welcomed at the time. With the recording completed, I approached the Prince Edward County Memorial Hospital Foundation. Our local hospital is currently undertaking a major campaign, Back the Build, to raise funds for construction of a brand new hospital. We discussed various ways the song might be used and came up with the idea of making a copy of the song and lyrics available for donors. Between PECMHF and myself, we publicized this campaign via local newspaper and 99.3 County FM, our local community radio station, as well as through social media. At the end of the campaign, $2,137.46 were raised towards our much needed new hospital. Reflecting back, it was a wonderful way to give ourselves some purpose musically, and then to use this song to help make some tangible positive impact at the time where so many negative things were happening. Our last narrative of the evening. When the COVID-19 pandemic in 2019-2021 reached global proportions, it hampered the weekly output of my ongoing, as of 2021, anthropomorphic web comic series Hounds of Love down to a near monthly pace due to the temporary loss of access to my digital studio space for specific precautionary health measures that I had used for many years to create my work with. However, after managing to acquire a free secondhand scanner along with my laptop's Photoshop program, I was able to continue my online work, and before long, COVID-themed strips became the mainstay in the first year, for which I entitled the series Love in the Time of COVID-19. A tongue-in-cheek reference to the Nobel Prize-winning author Gabriel Garcia Marquez classic's 1985 novel Love in the Time of Cholera. Ranging in various topics of the period, from socio-political commentary to the physical and emotional isolation, the change and challenges of relationships to COVID observations and norms of the day that by the characters themselves, along with the advancement of communicational technology that had become reliant upon, like the rise of video chat platform Zoom, the first two strips in the series remain the cornerstone, since it takes on a very personal narrative for me and the importance of art to reflect the times that we live in. My first strip is where I pay tribute to my late paternal uncle, Aldwyn BYNOE, a victim of the first pandemic wave in England, and inspired by children's sidewalk chalk drawings that were common in almost every neighborhood to uplift the communal spirit in an otherwise grim atmosphere of the times, gives it more innocent and hopeful tone, even as the protagonist, Angelique Grillo, scrawls in French. I miss my uncle in relationship to her faraway relatives studying in England, as opposed to my deceased one. And the second strip below takes in a, oh, I didn't, yeah, right below. And the second strip below takes a lighter vibe in paying homage to noted installation artist Christo, as well as patronizing pandemic stockpiling, in particular to bathroom tissue, which was so prevalent in the early days of the pandemic. If anyone would like to, or I would like to thank everyone who donated time, effort, articles, and narratives to this project. And I hope that this collection can be so helpful in the future. If you would like to access any of the documents or aspects of the project that I mentioned tonight, the manuscript, blog post, and this lecture will be available on the Museum of Healthcare's website. Thank you for joining me tonight, and I hope that each of you stay safe, happy, and healthy through the rest of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm going to hand it back, I think, to Kevin to do the question and answer portion of this evening. Thank you so much.
Sure. Well, I think I will be the first one to say congratulations on getting through it, Savannah. I know, I've only been at the museum since 2017, but I've seen, several people go through this, and I know that feeling at the end when you're like, and thank you to everybody. And like, I know that that's a really certainly a super big deal. So I am going to end the recording of the presentation in just a second, but before I do, I think I'm going to I think everybody in the chat and everybody at home watching and everybody who wasn't able to watch, I will say a big, congratulations on getting through it. Thank you for presenting with us tonight. For all of you that are watching at home, if you'd like to share your sort of congratulations or thank yous, you can either share them in the chat or whatever works for you. I am going to now stop the recording. So